Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to COASTER-net Update. We've got some news to talk about this evening out of Grand Prairie, Texas, where in the past week or so, we've learned that Six Flags has entered into new licensing agreements with some parks that they used to own. Now, Danny, I think the big thing here is that they are licensing these parks and not outright buying them. There's a number of water parks. The two theme parks that we're going to focus on this evening are Darien Lake and Frontier City. Now, Danny, what were some of your initial thoughts when you heard this drop last week or so?
Right. This happened, the night before, really, I left for my 4-day Texas trip. So we didn't really have a chance to talk about this.
It actually happened. I was in the airport. You texted me on my way to Twisted Cyclone.
Yeah, that's right. So this happened Wednesday evening. This news came out Wednesday evening of last week, and Tuesday. You were at the airport waiting for your flight to Atlanta. And I was packing up for my Texas trip because I left on Thursday evening to go down to the Philly area for my airport. You were at Media Day all day Wednesday and came home Wednesday night. I left Thursday, so we didn't have a chance to talk about this. So they purchased 5 parks in general. And when I say purchased, we need to clarify this. So like you said, they did not outright buy the parks. They purchased the lease rights. So what that means, essentially what that means is
they get to manage the park.
They get to operate the park. So in a way, it's sort of like how they used to run Kentucky Kingdom and Six Flags New Orleans. Darien Lake, so they got 5 parks altogether. I'm on you can tell I'm on Wikipedia here. So they got Wet and Wild Phoenix. They got Wet and Wild Splash Town, which is the park in Spring, Texas, which is near Houston. Which ironically is where I just was. And they also got Whitewater Bay, which is the water park nearby Frontier City in Oklahoma City. Then they also got Frontier City, which is the dry park in Oklahoma City. And they got Darien Lake, which is between Buffalo and Rochester, New York, kind of up here in my neck of the woods. Now, these parks are still owned by EPR Properties. That is the owner of the park. These 5 parks, Six Flags has purchased the operating and leasing rights to these parks. So Six Flags will now be operating these parks. These parks were formerly operated by Premier Parks, which is actually what Six Flags Incorporated once was before they got all the Six Flags parks. So it's kind of a little bit of irony there. There are still EPR properties that are being operated by Premier Parks. So EPR didn't sell the lease rights from all the parks that Premier was operating. Premier Parks still operates Magic Springs, which is a park you're going to be heading down to in a few weeks. Myrtle Waves Water Park, which is in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Rapids Water Park, which is in Riviera Beach down in Florida. Wet and Wild Hawaii, Wet and Wild Palm Springs, and then Wild Waves Theme Park, which is just outside of Seattle, which is the park that hopefully I'll be going to later on this summer. So it's interesting that they only got some of those parks, and I think the most intriguing one is Darien Lake, personally, because that's really close to me, only about 2.5 hours away. But I think the thing that really caught people's attention is that Darien Lake, 12, 13 years ago, before Six Flags sold off a lot of properties, like when they closed Astro World and sold off Village Gardens, one of those parks was Six Flags Darien Lake. And unlike Frontier City, I think at one point was part of that, or was part of Premier Parks in the early stages, but it was never a Six Flags branded park. Darien Lake for 6 or 7 years there, from the late 90s, I think 1999 when they built Superman, might have even been a little bit earlier, until 2005-06 when it was sold off, was very clearly a Six Flags branded park and had the IPs. You had Superman Ride of Steel. There's no reason to think that wouldn't come back. because that ride has just been Ride of Steel for many years. There's no reason to think that they wouldn't just put the Superman stuff back on there and try and make some extra money. They already have the license agreement for the DC Comics, so they're not going to be spending any extra, I don't think, to put that back on there. The interesting thing with Darien Lake is they just opened a new roller coaster this past weekend, the Gerstlauer Eurofighter Tantrum, which is the clone of the Iron Shark at the Galveston Island Historic Pleasure Pier. Another ride just rode this past weekend. A good little ride, fun little ride. A little bit of an odd choice for Darien Lake, maybe not quite as big as something they would maybe need, maybe not quite the big attraction that a park like Darien Lake might need, considering they haven't had a big attraction in a long time. But it seems like Eurofighters are kind of the trend for these small to mid-sized parks right now. We've seen parks like Canopy Lake get one. Adventureland just got Monster. Cannibal Lagoon is a Eurofighter style ride, even though it's not by Gerstlauer. So I think the most intriguing part of this whole discussion is very easily the return of the possibility of an RMC of the Predator wooden roller coaster. Because when I was a Darien Lake season pass holder, 4 or 5 years ago, when I did one of my internships in the summer out in the Buffalo area, one of the surveys I got was about the Lake Monster project, which is what they were going to call this. It was going to be a revamp of the Predator. It sounded like it was going to be topper track, and that was when Herschend was still operating the park prior to EPR buying the park, and then from CNL, which was two years ago, when Herschend backed out, that kind of ended the possibility of anything happening there. So I think that might be the most intriguing prospect of Six Flags coming in here.
Well, yeah, and you would expect that. I'd pretty much assume that it wouldn't be topper track, that you'd go full RMC Iron Horse at this point.
Given the Six Flags relationship, you would think that's how they would go.
And Predator was always one of those coasters that we had targeted to get an RMC redo of some sort. It's big enough where there's enough to work with there that I think you could make a pretty nice Iron Horse out of it. Six Flags has proven that you can make a pretty nice Iron Horse out of even smaller ones, like I just said, Twisted Cyclone. I thought it was a really nice, Iron Horse rendition. So I think that becomes the most intriguing aspect. You wonder with the leasing rights how much Six Flags is going to pour money into these parks. Something like an Iron Horse, like you would assume that anything Six Flags puts in, they could take with them if things go south. But an Iron Horse, I don't think that's really something you can take with you. So maybe we won't see that.
Well, and that brings back the whole issue of when Kentucky Kingdom was closed. The year before Kentucky Kingdom actually closed, they removed Chang and relocated it to Great Adventures Green Lantern. And they claimed it was for a water park expansion, which then never happened. Right. And there was a lot of debate about that as to, they were just getting their biggest asset out before they closed the park, and there was a big debate over who owned the rides. And Six Flags said, well, we're just, I remember Six Flags saying, we're actively looking to relocate all the attractions at this park. And the Kentucky State Fair Board was like, no, those are our rides because they're an improvement on the property. They're bolted to the ground. And that was the big debate. So I think that would come back into play here, since they're just leasing the operating rights from these parks. Same thing with Six Flags New Orleans. They didn't own that land. They were operating the park. So they kind of like pulled out, and it's like, we're just going to kind of leave you guys holding the bag. So if things go south, then Six Flags could kind of be, I don't know what the terms of the agreement are. If there's an opt-out clause somewhere in there, if they have to do it for a certain number of years and then they can opt out, or maybe either side can opt out. I don't really know, but it's certainly, if they were outright buying the parks, you would think, okay, they're going to start investing here, especially in a park like Darien Lake, where there's not a ton of competition there. Cedar Fair is in that southern Ontario market with Canada's Wonderland. You think that you could – there was just a big incident there at Darien Lake this past weekend with one of the concerts, and some of the folks who were getting in trouble were from Southern Ontario. So they very clearly get visitors from Southern Ontario to the park. So you would think some investment would actually help them compete just a little bit with Canada's Wonderland and put Six Flags in that Western New York, Southern Ontario market, which currently they are not in.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see what happens here. I think the leasing agreements show that Six Flags has a little confidence, but not complete confidence in these parks. Because otherwise they probably don't have the cash to outright buy anything. That's not in the Six Flags marketing plan.
Well, especially since they're building all these parks in China, supposedly. They're spending a lot of money over there.
Well, and they just announced a whole nother, set of parks out in China. So you can go and see on our news stories, all the information on that as well. So we'll keep you updated here on what happens, and probably can expect to see changes starting to be made, not this season, possibly next season is when we'll first see all these.
Yeah, I think the word that I was hearing is that Six Flags season passes will start to be honored at those two parks next year in full, and there will be a transition in full next year. This year they will not be honoring Six Flags season passes, but they will be offering discounts in park for Six Flags season pass holders. So if you have a Six Flags pass, you will have to pay to go into Darien Lake, but you will get some discounts and some nice little perks once you get inside the gate. So, or maybe you want to wait till maybe there's an RMC there in a couple years.
So, as always, thanks for joining us here on COASTER-net Update. I'm, of course, Andrew Barczak from Chicago, Illinois.
And Danny Miller from Binghamton, New York.
Right on, right, Warriors.
See you guys.